We are live.
I was just saying
They
hello to
call
everyone
you
on
on your phone.
Facebook.
She's ordering Chipotle for lunch. She's not. And somebody's calling me right now on my phone, so it's okay. Well, hello, everybody.
Hi.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. It is week 3
Yeah.
of,
Is it 3?
I don't know.
Let's see. Let's talk about what we talked about. We talked about Ash Wednesday.
Yes,
We talked about
birth to
birth to
baptism.
baptism, Sermon on the Mount.
So today,
This is our fourth. We've just concluded
it's week 4.
Yeah, we've concluded the 3rd week of Lent. It's our 4th time coming to you.
Time is a weird concept the
It
last
is.
12 months. And anyway, so.
How many days do you not know what day it is?
I just told Jasmine I've been operating all morning like today was Thursday. And knowing that like I'm doing my normal Wednesday routine
Right.
and met with Lyle and
Yeah.
our executive pastor. But anyway, we are glad that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with us. If you are with us on social media, especially, or whether you're watching through the Vintage app or Facebook, say hello. Let us know that you're here. Maybe even let us know from where you are watching. If you're local, if you're part of the Vintage family, or maybe you're not part of Vintage, but
Yeah.
somehow you've stumbled upon these conversations that Jasmine and I are having. And what we're doing is walking up to Resurrection Sunday. We're going to be celebrating Easter here at Vintage in just a few weeks, Sunday, April the 4th. And I hope that you're planning to worship somewhere on that Sunday. We are trying to accommodate more folks here at Vintage. So if you haven't heard, on Easter Sunday, we're going to be adding a 3rd experience that Sunday morning. We're going to still be taking reservations, but this will open up more and more spots.
Yep.
But we're excited to worship with you. Continue to pay attention to social media and your email if you're a part of our church. And more details about service times, gathering times, all that kind of thing will be coming soon. But to kind of get us ready, we decided that we were going to kind of lean in during Lent. Lent is that 40-day period, not including Sundays, that walks us up to the celebration of the empty tomb. And so we started out just inviting everybody to do a little something different in this season, whether God was calling you to fast, to kind of abstain from something, to remove something that is important, to replace it with something that's just kind of more important for this season, a fast of food, a fast of an activity that just gives you an opportunity to lean into God a little bit more.
Yeah.
And what we're doing in these conversations is leaning into the very place that makes the most sense, walking up towards celebrating Jesus' resurrection, and that's leaning into the life and teachings of Jesus. So we've kind of been systematically doing that for the last few weeks.
Right. And a lot of this came out of a conversation that we had leading up to Lent. And for me personally, I had gone through years and years and years of Easter Sunday was basically like every other Sunday, except we had a cantata, okay? We had, the cantata, or we had the Easter pageant.
Somebody thinks you just sneezed on
Cantata.
cantata. Bless you.
Or we had the Easter pageant where we did like a play essentially, or a musical of the life of Jesus. And that was sort of what set Easter apart, was that it was just a Sunday that looked different from the other Sundays. But I don't know, it was after one of our kids was born, I remember that Easter particularly, leading up, like the weeks leading up, I just leaned really heavy into the Gospels, and particularly the Gospel of John. And walking through the Gospel of John up through Holy Week and into Sunday. And I remember that Good Friday. It sticks out. I will never forget. I was reading in the bathroom because it was the only quiet place in my house. So it was like sitting in the floor, leaned up against the tub with my Bible. And I remember reading about the crucifixion of Jesus on Good Friday. And I remember reading and thinking I know what's coming and I'm not ready for it. Because I had been so invested. I love a good book. I love a good novel, a good story. And I had really taken time to walk through that gospel and think about Jesus as a human, Jesus as a person who lived on this earth, who smelled things and tasted things and felt things. And I was so invested in the story of Jesus in a way that I had not been before. I knew that he was my savior. I believed in him. I learned from him, but really like digging in deep. And I remember just being in tears that Good Friday thinking, I don't want him to die, and being mad, like,
wow.
Jesus, like, you are innocent. Speak up for yourself. Come on.
Well, you're right, though, because I think sometimes, especially, for those of us who grew up in the church, you celebrate Christmas, you celebrate Easter, and it becomes, familiarity breeds contempt.
Absolutely.
That you get so used to hearing these stories, reading these stories, that they almost lose their wonder, they lose their power, because that's just when we're so exposed to the same thing over and over and over again, it's really easy for them to just become a part of ritual, tradition, habit. And almost like the life of Jesus becomes this superhero in a comic book.
Yeah.
We forget that Jesus, fully man, fully God, but actually had flesh, blood, walked, felt dirt between his toes, knew what it was like to experience human touch and heartbreak. And sometimes we get so disconnected from that reality.
Yeah.
And even especially when we think about Jesus, Jesus died on the cross, but we don't even lean into the agony of all that.
Yeah.
And the fact that in this book we have these 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that give us a glimpse, a little window into the Savior of the world. And what we're trying to do through these conversations is to invite you to lean in with us.
Yeah.
And we try to keep these conversations around 30 minutes, so we can't unpack a ton. But what we hope is that what you're hearing from us is inspiring you to open up your Bible, and in this Lent season, do your own deep dive into the life and teachings of Jesus. And so we started week 1. It was kind of birth to baptism.
Yep.
That's on demand somewhere. It's on our app. These are all stored on the Vintage app. So you can go to a little folder if you've missed one or just want to listen to it again or watch it again.
Just click on videos so you know. So on the app, open on that front page. Up at the top, it says like home, videos, and something else. I feel like I should know this. If you'll click on videos, you'll see all of the Lent conversations there.
Yeah, so Jasmine and I kind of developed an outline. Birth to baptism, that period of Jesus' life we knew very little about, yet we can learn so much from. And then, we talked about...
we talked about the Sermon on the Mount.
The Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
And today we're kind of moving into... Jesus taught a lot of truth through the Sermon on the Mount. And you almost kind of think of that as like some traditional teaching, preaching. But the way that Jesus communicated most was through metaphors and parables.
Yes.
If you read through the Gospels, one of the things that you'll notice is in trying to teach these really deep, powerful truths, Jesus always or most often used a metaphor taking materials, things that would have connected and resonated with the everyday lives of those hearing it for the first time.
Yeah.
And so today we kind of want to lean into that, the Jesus parables, because there are dozens of them littered throughout the Gospels, except for the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is, and if you know anything about studying the Bible, there are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are known as the synoptic Gospels. And then there's this Gospel of John. And we don't really know exactly why John chose to write about Jesus the way that he did. We know that he wrote it last.
Right. And so I think a lot of the reason that it is so different is because since he wrote it last, he already knew what had been written about
The other 3
Jesus.
would have been already circulating.
They're already circulating, and he says, I don't need to reteach the things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already done. I need to share a side of Jesus that these 3 don't reveal.
Right.
Because John had a very different seat than the perspective of the other Gospels.
And if you missed it, we walked through the Gospel of John this summer.
Yeah.
And so that entire series also on the app, on our YouTube channel, you can watch, where we, not necessarily verse by verse and chapter by chapter, but did an exhaustive Sunday morning dive into the Gospel of John.
And that series is called This is Vintage?
And it was like a summer
series. Yeah, it's just called Summer Series.
But Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just saturated with these parables and metaphors of Jesus. And what a parable is, and let me kind of give you three kind of definitions of a parable. It's a comparison of two seemingly different things.
Right.
But the way that I always heard it growing up, it's an earthly story with heavenly truth.
Implication, yeah.
And so Jesus would teach these stories through these parables. And one of the things that you notice is, and we talked about this yesterday, nobody ever told Jesus you're not supposed to answer a question with a question. One of the things that you'll notice in the Gospels is when Jesus is asked a question, very rarely does he give like this simple, direct answer.
Right.
Typically, he responds with one of these metaphors or one of these stories or one of these parables. And I think Jesus was trying to teach us something there. There's a lot of reasons why Jesus used parables.
Many reasons.
And if you go into Matthew chapter 13, right in the middle of Jesus telling the parable of the sower, the disciples are like, Jesus, why do you do this?
Right.
Why do you make this so hard? Just tell us.
Yeah.
And I think we both kind of have some perspectives on why Jesus chose to use parables.
Yeah, so for a couple reasons, I think one is that Jesus was always surrounded by people. There were very few times that it was just Jesus and his disciples, like those 12 chosen disciples. There were so many people around because everybody was so curious about Jesus. And a lot of the things that they were asking him were sort of the mysteries of faith and the mysteries of God and the kingdom of heaven. And so many times throughout these parables, he would say this phrase of, those who have ears, let them hear. And what he was saying is, I'm teaching you something, and if you have the ears to discern what deeper truth there is, what heavenly implications there are here, you will hear them. If you don't hear those things, it's a nice story. It can teach you something. It can teach you about investing. It can teach you about farming. It can teach you about, cleaning your house. It can teach you about keeping your lamps trimmed up and they're cautionary tales
right.
at first glance. But he was trying to reveal the mysteries of the kingdom in front of a broad audience. He didn't always have the luxury of just being with his disciples. And so most of the time in teaching parables, a rabbi or a teacher would give the parable and then would later on interpret that parable for his disciples. And so we see that here in Matthew 13 with the parable of the sower, where they ask him, what does this mean? And he does interpret that. Now, we don't see the interpretation of every single parable, but we can assume that at some point because a good teacher would interpret those parables for just his disciples.
Yeah. And you wonder if there were moments when Jesus we have these recorded parables, and we've said all throughout these conversations, we get a very small glimpse into everything Jesus said and did. But he would offer up these stories, and I always wonder, what were the one-on-one conversations with Thomas?
Oh, yeah.
Or with Thaddeus or some of these other disciples. But even, I think, as a communicator, going back to the time and the culture, and it happened after Jesus' time too, where the religious people would try to hijack the truth.
Yes.
They would try to keep it to themselves, keep it in language that folks didn't understand, make it like super complicated. And Jesus is not trying to complicate the truth anyway. Yes, there's a level of investigation that he's wanting to inspire. That he's saying, you know what, you're asking a question. Let me tell you a story that's going to help you start asking better questions.
Yes. So I was making a note while you were saying this. Was like, there's something that you said that kind of sparked that in me. But yeah, it's because there's more to think about than just the answer to that question. And sometimes the question that you asked isn't the question that you need to be asking. That's not the one that needs to be answered.
That's good.
Yeah.
Because Jesus is like, let me give you a story, and it may not exactly answer that question, but it may help inspire you to start asking the questions that you need to ask in order to experience the change that needs to happen in your life.
Yeah. So can I give an example of that one? So my favorite example of that one is the parable of the Good Samaritan. You can find the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. It's a very familiar story. Yeah. And the question that is asked Jesus is, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, what's written in the law? How does it read to you? And he answered and said, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the man said to him, or Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and here's the question that the person asked, and who is my neighbor?
It's a great example.
Yeah, so he says, so that's the question that needs to be asked, that the man wants to know is, well, who's my neighbor? Who is it that I am accountable for loving? Like, who am I, supposed to be caring about? Jesus answers with the story of the Good Samaritan, where he says there's this Samaritan who he's beaten up, left, robbed, naked by the side of the road. There's all these religious people who see the man cross to the other side of the street and ignore him. And then there's a Samaritan who comes by, and he's the one that takes care of them. So in the end, here's what Jesus says. He answers this question with a story and then the question. It says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who showed mercy to him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same. So initially the question was, who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. It's not who is your neighbor, but what does it mean to be a good neighbor? It's about you. It's about what you need to become, not who you need to attend to. Because when you have that internal change, you see everyone as your neighbor. So that's an example that I thought of Jesus says, look, I get what you're trying to ask, but you're asking the wrong question.
That's so
Let
good.
me show you why.
You can never land at the right answer if you keep asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
And that's part of what Jesus does through these. And through these parables, you get to see such powerful truth and what matters to God.
Yeah.
And I think that was Jesus' biggest frustration with the religious people of his day. It was, the problem isn't your theology.
No.
The problem isn't even your understanding of the law. It's a misapplication of it because your priorities have somewhere gotten off. And I need to calibrate that.
Yeah.
And the way I'm going to do that is not just giving you simple yes, no, this, that.
Here's a checklist for you.
Let's get to the heart of the issue so that we can start shifting this back to the way that I intended it to be.
Well, in saying get back to the heart of the issue, that's I think why he started with the Sermon on the Mount. Because that taught us it's not about the letter of the law, it's about the heart of the law. He's saying you need to get back to changing your heart and not just trying to monitor your behavior.
Yeah, that's so good. And as you read through these parables, it's going to do the same for you.
Yeah.
This is a reminder too that the point of Scripture. I don't think it's a good goal to say. A lot of people come into the year and think, I'm going to read through the entire Bible this year. Okay, I get what you're saying,
sure.
But the goal isn't necessarily just to get through the Bible.
Right.
It's to get the Bible in us, to get application to it. And when it comes to these parables, there's going to be times where you have to read it and read it and read it and read it and think and pray and process. And I think even in that, Jesus is trying to say, don't just rush through this.
Right.
I'm trying to get you to think. I'm trying to get you to process this stuff so that you can land where you need to land. And it's also a reminder that, God's never tried to turn us into puppets. He's trying to give us these things and gently lead us as the good shepherd to these places that we need to be to find his truth in a way. And when you dig it out on your own, when you've had to do that hard work of getting to that place, it has a different level of value in your heart when you've had to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a particular parable that you always kind of go back to, or one that, I don't know, just means a lot to you?
Yeah.
Yeah?
The parable of the sower. And as you were talking, maybe it's because Jesus explains it for me. Maybe that's why that one,
Yeah.
I've preached that one
Yes.
more than any other. But if you're not familiar with the parable of the sower, it's in Matthew chapter 13. And basically, Jesus is once again going into an object lesson that would be super familiar to the people hearing it. Farming, sowing,
Right.
Look about how many of the parables that Jesus uses connect to that agriculture type
Right.
realm.
That's who he was teaching.
That's who he was teaching.
Yeah.
And even as a preacher, it reminds me that you need to engage people with truth in a way that is familiar to them.
Right.
And that's why, I don't understand why we don't value in some places innovation and creativity in the church, because Jesus was saying the way that you're going to need to teach truth is going to have to be in a way that people can connect to and resonate with.
Right.
But and it hits me on so many levels. It constantly, because he basically saying that there's a farmer throwing this seed. And he's throwing the seed everywhere. He's tossing it, but that seed falls on different types of soil. And depending on the condition of the soil, it receives the seed, and what happens as a result of the seed is very, very different. And so just personally, it reminds me of that I need to cultivate the soil of my heart to be able to receive the seed that he has for me. That he's constantly throwing his seed, his word at me. But what it does in my life is really dependent on my willingness to receive it and let it take root. But then on another level for me, it reminds me as a preacher, as a tosser of seed,
Right.
that in this room, there's all kinds of soil. And I'm not responsible for their soil. I'm only responsible for scattering the right seed.
Right.
And so on so many levels, it just really speaks to my heart.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, so kind of along with that parable, I like that parable also because of that. A lot of parables, there is one direct teaching from it. But in those longer parables, like the parable of the sower, you do see it from a lot of different perspectives. And, whether it's you as the soil receiving the seed or you as the sower, there are a lot of different ways that you can apply its truth to your life. For me, one of my favorite parables was always the parable of the talents. And at first glance, we can look at it and say, oh, Jesus is trying to teach us about money. That this is about how we should wisely invest our money. And there are implications of that. Sure. Like that's everybody in the room who was listening to him share the parable of the talents, which is found in Matthew 25, that's the immediate application is if you are entrusted with money, you should wisely invest it so that you can say, hey, I didn't just mess around. But this parable is actually the part of a larger conversation, which I think is also an interesting conversation that we're having right now in the church. And we get this question a lot in relation to what we've experienced with the pandemic, fires worldwide, hurricanes, tornadoes. Everybody wants to know, is it the end of times? Is Jesus coming back?
We're closer today than we were yesterday.
We're closer today than we were yesterday. And it's in that same conversation that Jesus uses this parable to answer the question that nobody in the room was actually asking. So if you look back, and this is where context matters so much. When you look back into Matthew 24, the question that is being answered, he's talking about the sign of his coming, of his second return. And they ask the question, they want to know, hey, when are you gonna be coming back? They want a date. And Jesus, he answers, he says, look, the time that I'm coming back, that's not for me to decide. That's for the Father. All of these things are gonna happen. There's gonna be wars and rumors of wars and all of these things. But then he goes on in verse 42, he says, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible servant from whom his master put in charge of his household to give them food at their proper time? And he kind of goes on with that. But he's saying that you're asking the wrong question. Don't ask, when am I coming? Instead, ask, what do I need to do to be ready?
Yeah.
And so we get so caught up in trying to read the signs of the times. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with being interested in that, but I think that if that's consuming you, we're consumed with the wrong thing. And so what he does is he comes back and he answers this question with the parable of the 10 virgins, which is saying there were 10 virgins and some of them had lamps that were filled with oil and they were waiting for the bridegroom to come. And then some of the virgins had lamps and they didn't have oil, and the bridegroom comes and they say, hey, can we have some of your oil? And they're like, no, we can't do that. Like, well, we need this. You go and buy your oil. When the time that they had gone to buy the oil for the lamps, the bridegroom had already come. And they missed out on that opportunity. So the parable of the talents answers this question, and it's a story about a master who calls his slaves and he says, I'm going to give my possessions to you. To one, he gives 5 talents, and a talent is a measure, a weight of money.
Yeah.
He gives some 5 talents, one 2 talents, and then one 1 talent. And the one with 5 doubles it to 10. The one with 2 doubles it to 4. And the one who's only given 1 talent buries it in the ground. And then the master comes back and they have to give an account for what they were entrusted with. And for the ones who doubled what the master had given him, he says, well done, you good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things, and enter into the joy of your master. But then the one that would receive the 1 talent came and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, here you have what is yours. And his master answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have put the money in the bank, and on my arrival, I would have received my money back with interest. And so when I think about this, and especially in the context of, we're talking about influence right now.
Yeah.
And we're talking, so this parable is about investing, and it's about being ready because we don't know when Jesus is coming back. And how are we investing right now? How are we using our influence to multiply what God has entrusted to us? And when I think about that word invest, you always think about money. But when Jesus says, like, don't invest your time in your life in things that are going to rot.
Yeah.
Invest your time in things that are eternal. And the only thing in this whole world that is eternal are people.
Yeah.
Our souls are eternal. And so we need to spend our time. We need to spend whatever God has entrusted with us with, whether it is our money, it's our time, it's our talent, it's our ability, our skills. Invest those things in people for eternity.
Yeah.
And I've just been thinking about that in light of our influence. And like, am I wasting my influence? Am I more like the person, the slave, the servant who was entrusted with much, and I'm trying to turn a profit for the Lord upon his return to say, God, we've grown your kingdom? Or am I saying like, okay, you've given me this stuff and I'm just going to make sure that I'm good?
Yeah. That parable, that is a perfect correlation, and I don't think a lot of people think of it in that context.
Yeah.
And when you think about, trying to interpret and understand the principles Jesus is trying to teach us from these parables, when you see Jesus teach a parable, when he kind of layers them up,
Yeah.
when he goes from parable to parable to parable, very rarely are they not connected.
Right.
He's basically saying, all right, that flows into this and flows into this and flows into this. And when I think about that parable, that is a good one to kind of wrap up this conversation in, because it's so connected to what we're leaning into as a church.
Yeah.
And there's so many layers to that, even from the way that God, the way God sees distribution. He doesn't give
Right.
everybody the same things or the
Nope.
equal amount.
Yeah.
And even as you're sitting there thinking about it, I think in context of this last year, so often we get so consumed with how much we have that we lose sight of just using what we've been given. That it's more about, I don't have enough.
Yep.
I don't have enough. I don't have enough. And Jesus is like, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with what will you do with what you have?
Right.
How will you steward what you've been given? And
Well,
I don't think this is about money. I don't think that in any way just about money. That you have these commodities that have been given to you by God, whether it be time, influence, financial resources, gifts, abilities. And if you need to live with a sense of urgency,
Right.
because we don't know when he's coming back or when our time is up, but you also need, it's not just for you. It's to be, it is wasted if it is not multiplied.
Right.
In God's economy, multiplication is everything.
Yeah. And he goes on in chapter 25 to tell us how to invest.
Yeah.
He tells us this is what I mean by that. He says, when I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger, and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. And that's the way that we multiply what God has given, is by investing it, by looking and providing for others.
Yeah. This is one of those conversations because there's so much to lean into when it comes to Jesus teaching and through parables and these metaphors. But we encourage you guys, dive into the word as you walk towards Easter, as we continue to move throughout this Lent season. Carve out some time.
Yeah.
And our hope is that you walk away from this conversation and you're like, oh, whoa, we're done? Like, I want more.
Yeah.
That's what our hope is. So the life and teachings of Jesus is, if we're called to live and love like Jesus, we're called to follow him in every way. And constantly we lay our lives beside the life of Jesus, and we can't do that if we haven't been willing to dive deep into who he is. And so thanks for hanging out with us for a little while this morning. We hope that this has inspired you more than anything just to hunger for God's word a little bit more.
Yeah.
Keep leaning into the life of Jesus as we move closer and closer to Lent. We love you guys. We appreciate you jumping in. We're going to be here again live next Wednesday at 11.
Yep.
We'll see you this weekend. Have a great rest of the week. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Bye.